quiet morning, a peaceful cafe, and a regular cup of coffee, until everything changes. When trouble walks through the door, how far would you go to stand up against injustice? And who will step in when the line is crossed? This is a story you won't forget. Watch until the end and tell us, what would you have done in this situation? Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe for more gripping stories. The city remained cloaked in darkness, the faintest hints of dawn still hidden beneath the horizon. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional passing car, its headlights cutting through the cold morning air. The neon signs of closed shops flickered weakly, waiting for the first rays of sunlight to extinguish them for the day. A soft mist hung over the asphalt, making everything feel frozen in time. A black luxury car rolled to a stop in front of a small cafe on the corner. The engine hummed for a few seconds before shutting off, leaving only the distant sound of the city beginning to stir. The driver's door opened, and Jason Statham stepped out. Dressed in a dark coat, his movements were smooth and deliberate, exuding an air of quiet confidence. He shut the door behind him, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air before glancing at his watch. He knew the place wasn't open yet, but that didn't bother him. He came here every morning, always just a little too early, savoring the few minutes of solitude before the world woke up. The cafe was dark inside, and its windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. A small, closed sign hung on the door, gently swaying as the morning breeze passed through. Jason adjusted his coat, stepping forward to lean against the brick wall beside the entrance. He crossed his arms and waited, his gaze shifting to the quiet street. A few minutes later, the distant sound of footsteps echoed against the pavement. The rhythm was light, quick, and familiar. Jason didn't need to look to know who it was. The keys jingled before the lock clicked and the door pushed open. Katrina, the cafe's barista, stepped inside and flicked on the lights. She was a young black woman with a warm energy that always seemed to brighten the place, even before the sun had the chance. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her curly hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and yet, despite the early hour, she carried herself with a lively enthusiasm. Jason pushed off the wall just as she noticed him. "Good morning, Mr. Statham," Katrina greeted with a bright smile as she propped the door open to let the fresh air in. Jason raised an eyebrow slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're late today." Katrina gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. "Late? Me? Never." She let out a small laugh as she stepped behind the counter, tying her apron around her waist. "I might have overslept by just a minute or two, but I promise I'm still faster than anyone else you'll find." Jason smirked. "That's debatable." "Oh, come on. Don't be cruel this early in the morning." She rolled her eyes playfully before gesturing toward the espresso machine. "Your usual?" Jason nodded. "Yeah, just like always." Katrina immediately got to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She turned on the grinder, filled the portafilter, and tamped the coffee grounds with just the right amount of pressure. Jason watched her for a moment, admiring the way she handled everything so effortlessly. "You know, you always come in before I even set up." Katrina spoke over the sound of steaming milk. "Even earlier than me, which is impressive. Most people don't wake up at this hour unless they have to." Jason leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I don't like distractions. It's peaceful in the morning. No crowds, no noise, no unnecessary attention." Katrina nodded in understanding as she set his cup under the spout and pressed the button to extract the shot. The machine hissed as rich, dark coffee poured into the cup, releasing a fragrant aroma into the air. Makes sense. I guess that's a luxury not everyone gets. She flashed him a knowing look as she finished preparing his drink. Here you go, just the way you like it. Jason took the cup with a nod of thanks, lifting it to his lips and taking the first sip. The strong, bold flavor immediately hit his taste buds, grounding him in the moment. He had been coming here for weeks now, and Katrina had never once gotten his order wrong. He turned and walked toward the far end of the cafe, choosing his usual table by the window. The chair made a soft, scraping sound against the wooden floor as he sat down, unfolding a newspaper and setting it on the table. He took another sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. For the next several minutes, everything was exactly as he liked it. Quiet, calm, undisturbed. As time passed, the cafe began to stir with life. A few early customers trickled in, their voices soft but filled with familiarity. The scent of fresh pastries filled the air, blending with the rich aroma of coffee. Katrina moved effortlessly behind the counter, chatting with regulars as she served them. Jason finished his drink, folding his newspaper neatly as he glanced at his watch. He had gotten exactly what he came for, a moment of peace before the day truly began. He stood up, grabbing his coat, and was just about to head for the door when the door slammed open, the impact so hard it rattled the glass. A loud, heavy thud echoed through the cafe as someone kicked it open from the outside. The once peaceful atmosphere shattered instantly. All eyes turned toward the entrance as three figures stepped inside, their boots stomping loudly against the wooden floor. Jason's grip on his coat tightened. The tension in the air shifted immediately. The cafe, once filled with warmth and quiet conversation, suddenly felt colder, heavier. Jason didn't move, didn't react, but his gaze sharpened as he silently watched the three newcomers. They were big, loud, and unapologetically aggressive. Bikers. Their leather jackets were decorated with patches, and the leader, a burly man with a graying beard, had a smug grin on his face as he scanned the room like he owned it. Then his gaze landed on Katrina, and his expression changed into something darker. Jason slowly placed his coffee cup back on the table, his fingers curling into a loose fist. He had come here for peace. But peace had just walked out the door. The heavy stomp of boots filled the cafe as the three bikers swaggered inside, their presence shifting the atmosphere in an instant. Conversations quieted. A few customers instinctively leaned back in their seats, their eyes darting between the intruders and the young barista behind the counter. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scruffy gray beard, scanned the cafe with a smug expression before his gaze landed on Katrina. His lips curled into a grin, the kind that carried nothing but trouble. "Oh, would you look at that," he drawled, nudging one of his companions with an elbow. "They'll let just about anybody make coffee these days." Katrina, who had been in the middle of cleaning the espresso machine, turned to face them, her expression calm and unreadable. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" Her voice was level, professional, unfazed by their presence. The second biker, a blond man with a thick silver chain around his neck, scoffed. "Look at her, acting all polite," he muttered. He leaned against the counter, his rings clinking against the surface. "You sure you know how to make coffee, sweetheart? I mean, with those hands and all." His gaze flicked pointedly to her skin. Jason, still seated at his table, quietly folded his newspaper, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes, however, remained locked on the scene unfolding before him. "I know how to make coffee." Katrina replied evenly, refusing to rise to the provocation. "What would you like?" The leader of the group chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know if I trust anything she makes," he said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "People like her, you never know what they might put in your drink." His words were dripping with mockery. The other two bikers snickered. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman, sitting near the door, reached for her bag as if considering whether to leave. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to notice the growing tension. Katrina's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands, but she remained composed. "If you don't want to order, please let the other customers enjoy their morning," she said firmly. The blonde biker let out a low whistle, shaking his head in amusement. "Oh ho, she's got an attitude," he smirked, nudging the third biker, a bald man with tattoos covering his arms. "Bet she thinks she's real special." The leader stepped closer to the counter, placing both hands on the surface as he leaned in. His smile had faded, replaced by something colder. "Listen, girl," he said, his tone dropping into something more dangerous. "You need to learn your place, and your place ain't talking back to me. Your place is cleaning up after real folks like us." Jason's jaw tightened. His fingers rested lightly against the table, his posture deceptively relaxed. But there was a shift in his expression, subtle but undeniable. His focus honed in on the leader's hands as they gripped the counter. Katrina exhaled slowly through her nose, standing her ground. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice controlled, steady. "But I also won't be disrespected in my own workplace." The bearded man narrowed his eyes, clearly not expecting her to hold her ground. A flicker of irritation passed over his face before he suddenly reached out and grabbed a nearby customer's untouched cup of coffee from the counter. Before anyone could react, he threw the steaming coffee directly at Katrina. Gasps rang out through the cafe. The hot liquid splashed across the front of her uniform, staining the fabric a deep brown. A sharp breath hitched in her throat, but she didn't flinch. Her expression remained impassive, her gaze locked onto the man in front of her. "Oh, you think you're tough?" the leader sneered. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife, the blade catching the overhead lights. "Let's see how tough you really are." A chair scraped sharply against the floor. Jason Statham was on his feet. The bikers turned at the sound, their amusement faltering when they saw him standing there, calm, controlled, but undeniably dangerous. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. "That's enough," Jason said, his voice low and firm. The bearded man sneered, flicking the knife open with a practiced motion. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" he asked, taking a step toward Jason. Jason took a single step forward, his eyes locked onto the knife. "Someone who doesn't tolerate bullies." For a second, the leader hesitated. He wasn't stupid. The man standing in front of him was no ordinary customer. There was something in Jason's stance, in the way he carried himself, that sent a silent warning, one the bikers were too arrogant to heed. The blonde biker let out a short laugh, clapping his hands mockingly. "Oh, look at this guy," he jeered. "Thinks he's some kind of hero. What are you gonna do, tough guy? Throw a sugar packet at us?" Jason remained completely still. His face was unreadable. His breathing was steady. "You have two choices," he said, his tone controlled but edged with steel. "You can walk out that door now, or I can make you." A tense silence followed. Then the leader lunged, swinging the knife toward Jason's chest. But Jason Statham had already moved. His reflexes were lightning fast, his body shifting effortlessly to the side. In one fluid motion, he caught the leader's wrist, twisted it sharply, and the knife clattered to the floor. Before the biker could react, Jason drove his elbow hard into his stomach, making him stagger back with a choked grunt. The blonde biker cursed and rushed forward, throwing a wild punch. Jason sidestepped it easily, grabbing his arm and flipping him over his shoulder. The man crashed onto a nearby table, sending chairs skidding across the floor. The third biker hesitated. He wasn't sure whether to fight or flee. He made the wrong choice. He charged. Jason ducked beneath the incoming punch, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back in one swift, precise movement. With a hard shove, he sent the biker stumbling forward, colliding face first into the counter. The cafe erupted into chaos as customers scrambled to get out of the way. A few had their phones out, recording every second of what was happening. Katrina stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing to process the sheer efficiency with which Jason had dismantled his opponents. The leader groaned, picking himself up off the floor. His face was red with humiliation and rage. "You think you can just walk in here and humiliate us?" he spat. "We're not done with you yet." Jason didn't move. His stance remained loose, but his eyes were sharp, unwavering. "You've already lost," he said simply. "Don't make it worse for yourself." But the leader was too blinded by pride to listen. With a growl, he lunged again, this time aiming to tackle Jason. Jason barely even blinked. He caught the man by the front of his jacket, used his own momentum against him, and with a swift, controlled motion, slammed him onto the floor. The biker let out a grunt of pain, his energy drained. Jason placed a knee against his back, keeping him pinned. "Stay down," Jason said coldly. The other two bikers groaned, pushing themselves up, but none of them attacked again. The sound of police sirens cut through the air. Someone had called the cops. Jason glanced toward the door, then back at Katrina. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slowly, still processing everything. "I think so," she murmured. "Thank you." Jason straightened, releasing the leader just as the flashing lights outside signaled the arrival of law enforcement. The bikers had been defeated, but the night wasn't over yet. The atmosphere inside the cafe remained thick with tension, even as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder outside. The bikers lay scattered across the floor, groaning in pain, their arrogance shattered in an instant. Jason stood unmoving, his expression unreadable, his breathing steady despite the sudden burst of action. His body was relaxed, but his eyes remained sharp, locked onto the three men who had, just moments ago, been so sure of their own power. The leader clutched his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to push himself up from the floor. His face was twisted in rage, but beneath that, there was something else. Something closer to fear. He wasn't used to being put in his place, and it showed. The other two bikers fared no better. The blond one, still dazed from being thrown across the room, wiped at the corner of his mouth where blood had begun to trickle from a split lip. The bald one, who had been slammed into the counter, groaned as he tried to sit up, only to wince as pain shot through his shoulder. None of them made another move toward Jason. They weren't that stupid. The police sirens grew deafening as two black and white patrol cars screeched to a stop outside the cafe. Red and blue lights flashed against the windows, casting flickering shadows along the walls. A second later, the front door was shoved open, and 4 uniformed officers stormed in, hands hovering over their holsters, eyes scanning the scene with sharp precision. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked, his voice cutting through the thick silence. Jason didn't move. He didn't need to. He wasn't the one they were here for. Instead, his gaze flicked toward Katrina, who was still standing behind the counter, her chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face remained impassive, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she had endured. She met his gaze for a brief moment, and in that instant there was an unspoken understanding between them. The bearded leader of the bikers let out a harsh breath, lifting his hands in mock surrender as he glared at Jason. "You're dead, you hear me?" he spat. "This isn't over." Jason remained silent, his stare cold and unwavering. The officer nearest to the bikers grabbed the leader by the arm and yanked him to his feet, forcing him against the counter as he quickly cuffed his wrists behind his back. The man grunted but didn't resist. His pride had already taken enough of a beating for one night. The blonde biker cursed under his breath as he was dragged up next, the officer barely suppressing an eye roll as he secured the cuffs around his wrists. The bald biker didn't even put up a fight. He simply held out his hands, sighing as if resigning himself to the inevitable. One of the officers, a man with a stern face and a neatly trimmed mustache, turned his attention to Jason. "Sir, I've got a few questions for you," he said, his tone polite but firm. Jason gave a slow nod, stepping away from the bikers as the officers finished restraining them. He wasn't worried. He had nothing to hide. The officer gestured toward the door, indicating that he wanted to speak outside. Jason cast one last glance toward Katrina, making sure she was still okay, before following the officer out into the cool night air. The street outside was nearly empty, save for the 2 police cruisers parked along the curb. The flashing lights continued to pulse, illuminating the brick walls of the nearby buildings. Jason stood with his hands casually in his coat pockets, watching as the officer pulled out a small notepad and pen. "All right, Mr. Statham," the officer began. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Jason exhaled through his nose before responding, his voice even and controlled. "I came in for a coffee. These 3 came in after, started harassing the barista. It escalated." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "Escalated how?" "They threw coffee at her, made threats. One pulled a knife," Jason said plainly. The officer's eyes flicked up from his notepad, his expression shifting slightly. "A knife?" Jason gave a slow nod. "It's still inside, on the floor near the counter." The officer made another note, then looked back at Jason with a knowing expression. "And you stopped them?" Jason didn't confirm or deny it. He simply held the officer's gaze, his face unreadable. The officer let out a breath, shaking his head. "These guys have been causing trouble around town for weeks now," he muttered. "Glad someone finally put them in their place." He glanced toward the cafe's entrance, where another officer was now speaking with Katrina. "That young woman in there, she handled herself well," he added, his voice carrying a hint of admiration. Jason followed his gaze, watching as Katrina answered the officer's questions with quiet composure. "Yeah," he said, "she did." Inside the cafe, the atmosphere was beginning to return to normal, though a lingering tension still clung to the air. Some customers had quietly left, unwilling to be part of any further trouble, but others had stayed. Those who remained were watching Katrina with something close to admiration. A few approached her, offering quiet words of encouragement. One older woman even reached across the counter to pat Katrina's hand, her voice warm with sincerity. "You're stronger than they'll ever be," she told her. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Katrina nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. She had spent years learning how to endure moments like this, believing that silence was often the safest choice. But tonight had proven something different. Tonight had proven that standing her ground wasn't just about herself, it was about setting a precedent. Jason stepped back into the cafe after finishing his conversation with the officer. The room quieted slightly as he approached the counter, his presence still fresh in everyone's minds. Katrina straightened, meeting his gaze with newfound confidence. "Thank you," she said softly. Jason nodded once. "You held your ground," he replied. "That's not easy." Katrina exhaled a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I'm just tired of it," she admitted. "Tired of people thinking they can walk in and treat me like that." Jason's expression softened slightly. "The world's full of people like them," he said, "but it's also full of people like you. Strong, resilient, unwilling to back down. Don't let them take that from you." Katrina smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across her face for the first time that night. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had won. Jason glanced at his watch, realizing he needed to get going. He pulled a few bills from his pocket and placed them in the tip jar, a generous amount, far more than the price of a coffee. Katrina's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't question it. "Take care of yourself," Jason said as he took a step back, "and if you ever need help, don't be afraid to ask." Katrina nodded. "I'll be okay." With that, Jason turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped outside, the morning sunlight finally began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the street. The cafe was left buzzing with murmurs from the customers, many of whom were still trying to process what they had just witnessed. But one thing was clear. Jason Statham had left an unforgettable mark on everyone in that room. The morning air was crisp and carried the distant hum of a city waking up. The flashing police lights still cast red and blue reflections against the cafe's windows as the officers continued their work, gathering statements from the remaining customers. The three bikers were already being led toward the patrol cars, their wrists bound in cuffs, their heads lowered in shame and silent fury. The leader, his bearded face twisted with anger, threw one last glare at Jason as he was shoved forward by an officer. "This ain't over, Statham," he hissed under his breath, his voice full of venom. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jason didn't react. He didn't need to. His expression remained as calm and unreadable as ever, his hands casually resting in his coat pockets. The officer escorting the biker didn't have the same patience. He gave the man a firm shove, forcing him toward the back seat of the cruiser. "Shut up and get in," the officer ordered, slamming the door behind him. The blonde biker was next. He glanced once at Jason, his split lip still bleeding, and muttered a curse before climbing into the second vehicle without protest. The bald one simply shook his head, sighing heavily as he followed, as if regretting the choices that had led him to this moment. The doors shut with finality, locking them in. Katrina watched from inside the cafe, arms folded tightly over her chest. Her uniform was still stained with the coffee that had been thrown at her, but she stood tall, her expression firm. She wasn't going to let anyone see her shaken. The fear, the anger, the frustration, all of it burned beneath her skin, but she refused to let it control her. Instead, she focused on what mattered. Justice had been served, at least for now. The officer who had spoken with Jason earlier approached him again, closing his notepad as he tucked his pen into his vest pocket. "I've got all I need from you," he said. "The security cameras got everything. These guys are looking at multiple charges: assault, disorderly conduct, maybe even a hate crime enhancement." Jason gave a slight nod. "Good." The officer studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "Most people would have just called the cops and stayed out of it," he said. "You didn't." Jason's gaze remained on the patrol cars as they began to pull away from the curb. "Some things shouldn't be ignored," he replied simply. The officer nodded in understanding. "Well, you did the right thing, and you definitely handled yourself like someone who's had training." He left the sentence open-ended, an unspoken question hanging between them. Jason didn't answer. The officer smirked slightly but didn't push the issue. "Anyway, you're free to go, but if anything else comes up, we'll be in touch." Jason inclined his head slightly before turning back toward the cafe. As he stepped inside, the air still felt charged, but there was a noticeable shift. The fear had been replaced with something else: respect. The few remaining customers who had witnessed everything regarded him with quiet admiration. Some offered small nods of gratitude, others still looked stunned, processing what had happened. Katrina was wiping down the counter when Jason approached. She glanced up at him, her fingers tightening around the damp cloth in her hand. "You're still here," she noted, her voice unreadable. Jason pulled out his wallet and set a few large bills on the counter. "Another coffee," he said, "for the trouble." Katrina looked at the money, then back at him. "That's a bit much for just a coffee." Jason met her gaze evenly. "You went through a lot more than that today." She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Without another word, she turned and began preparing his drink. The rhythmic sounds of the espresso machine filled the cafe once again, blending with the quiet murmurs of the customers. "You know," Katrina said after a moment, her voice lighter now, "this isn't the first time I've had to deal with guys like that." She glanced over her shoulder at him. "But it's definitely the first time someone actually stepped in." Jason took the cup when she placed it in front of him. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Not everyone would have stood their ground." Katrina let out a short breath, leaning against the counter. "I've had to. It's either that or let people like them walk all over me." Jason took a sip of his coffee. "You shouldn't have to." A small, knowing smile crossed her lips. "Maybe not, but the world is what it is." She studied him for a second, her curiosity evident. "You didn't have to step in either. Most people don't." Jason shrugged slightly. "Most people should." Katrina smirked. "Guess that makes you not most people." Jason didn't respond. He simply took another sip of coffee. The cafe door opened, and a few new customers walked in, unaware of what had just happened. The atmosphere slowly returned to normal. The tension, the violence, the chaos, it had already begun to fade into memory. But Katrina knew she wouldn't forget it. And neither would anyone else who had been there. Jason set his cup down and adjusted his coat. "Take care of yourself," he said as he turned toward the door. Katrina watched him go, her arms crossed, a thoughtful look on her face. "You too, Mr. Statham." As Jason stepped outside, the early morning sunlight had finally begun to break through the buildings, casting a golden glow over the street. The city had fully awakened, but for the first time in a long while, Katrina felt like she had won something. And Jason Statham had made sure of it. The golden morning light streamed through the cafe's windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The tension from earlier had mostly faded, but a quiet hum of lingering energy still buzzed in the air. Customers spoke in hushed tones, some still glancing toward the door as if expecting the bikers to return. Katrina, now wiping down the counter with slow, methodical movements, exhaled softly, trying to shake off the weight of the encounter. Jason remained in his usual seat near the window, his fingers loosely wrapped around the warm ceramic of his coffee cup. His posture was as relaxed as ever, but his gaze was sharp, following the movements of the cafe's patrons, the way their shoulders were still slightly tense, the way their eyes lingered on Katrina with a newfound respect. He didn't like unnecessary attention, but he also knew that standing up against men like the bikers carried consequences. He wasn't worried about himself. But Katrina, she had been the real target. The door swung open again, and for a brief moment, the air in the cafe tightened. A man in a dark gray jacket stepped in, looking around as if searching for someone. He wasn't a biker, but his presence alone sent a ripple through the room. He walked with the practiced ease of someone used to being in control, his gaze calculating, his expression unreadable. He made a direct line for the counter, stopping just short of where Katrina stood. "You Katrina?" the man asked, his voice level but firm. Katrina stiffened just slightly before straightening her shoulders. "Depends on who's asking." The man didn't smile. "I'm Detective Alvarez, LAPD." He pulled a badge from his pocket and flashed it briefly before tucking it away. "I'm following up on what happened earlier." Katrina's grip on the cloth in her hand tightened for a fraction of a second. "You guys already arrested them. What else is there to follow up on?" Alvarez tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes assessing her. "I just need to confirm a few things. The officers who responded gave me a rundown, but I like to hear things directly from the people involved. You okay to talk?" Jason remained where he was, quietly observing. He had seen enough law enforcement types to recognize when someone was just doing their job versus when they had another angle in mind. Katrina nodded slowly. "Yeah, sure." Alvarez took out a small notepad and flipped it open. "The security footage showed most of what happened, but I need to confirm a few details. You've worked here for how long?" 2 years, Katrina said. "And have you ever had trouble with those guys before?" Katrina hesitated. "Not them specifically, but guys like them?" "Yeah." Alvarez nodded as if he expected that answer. "When they came in, did they say anything to suggest this was planned, or did it seem random?" Katrina exhaled. "I don't know. I mean, they seem like the type that just enjoys making trouble. I doubt they came in with a plan. They just saw me and decided I was an easy target." Alvarez jotted something down. "And when they threw the coffee at you, you didn't retaliate?" Katrina's expression hardened. "No, I did my job. They were the ones looking for a fight." Alvarez nodded again, his eyes flicking up from his notepad. "And Mr. Statham?" At that, Jason finally leaned forward slightly. "What about him?" Katrina asked, her voice carefully neutral. Alvarez turned to glance at Jason, his gaze sharp and measuring. "You stepped in as soon as a weapon was drawn. That correct?" Jason met his gaze evenly. "That's right." Alvarez tapped the edge of his notepad thoughtfully. "And before that, you didn't engage with them?" "No." Alvarez held Jason's stare for a moment longer before flipping his notepad shut. "Well, that's good news for you," he said simply, "because if you had thrown the first punch, we'd be having a different conversation." Jason didn't react. He knew how this worked. The law often blurred the lines when it came to fights like this. He had been in enough situations to know that even when you were on the right side of things, there were always technicalities. Alvarez turned back to Katrina. "Listen, I'm going to be straight with you. These guys, they're part of a larger crew that's been causing problems all over town. They've gotten away with a lot because no one's been willing to stand up to them. But what happened today? That's not something they'll take lightly." Katrina's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. You think they'll come back? Alvarez shrugged. I think guys like them don't like being embarrassed. And right now they're sitting in a holding cell, pissed off and thinking about how this played out. He tucked his notepad into his jacket pocket. We're keeping them locked up for now, but don't let your guard down. Jason's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like the way that sounded. Katrina, to her credit, didn't let the detective see her worry. I appreciate the warning, she said. Alvarez studied her for a moment before nodding. If anything happens, call it in. We'll be keeping an eye on things. With that, he turned and made his way to the door, pausing briefly as he passed Jason's table. And you? Jason lifted his coffee cup, taking a slow sip. What about me? Alvarez gave him a knowing look. Guys like you don't usually just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Jason didn't blink. Maybe I like the coffee. Alvarez smirked slightly but didn't push. Yeah, maybe. With that, he stepped outside, disappearing into the morning light. The cafe was silent for a moment after he left. Katrina let out a slow breath, running a hand over her face. Well, she muttered, that was reassuring. Jason set his coffee down, his expression unreadable. He's not wrong. Katrina gave him a dry look. Wow, thanks. That really makes me feel better. Jason didn't smile. I mean it. You should be careful. Katrina sighed. What am I supposed to do? Quit my job? Hide? I'm not letting some idiots scare me into changing my life. Jason studied her for a moment before leaning back slightly. Then don't. Just be ready. Katrina shook her head, muttering something under her breath as she grabbed a clean rag and started wiping down the counter again. You sound like you know what you're talking about, she remarked, glancing at him. Jason didn't answer right away. He simply took another sip of coffee, his mind already working through the possibilities. He had seen this before. He knew what men like those bikers were capable of when their pride was wounded, and something told him this wasn't over yet. The cafe had settled into a strange rhythm, balancing between the usual morning routine and the unease left behind by the earlier events. The lingering tension was invisible but heavy, pressing down on the air like a storm waiting to break. Katrina continued working as if nothing had happened, her movements steady, her hands quick as she filled orders. But every so often, Jason noticed the way her fingers tightened around a coffee cup, the way her gaze flickered toward the door, as if expecting trouble to walk back in at any moment. Jason remained seated, his coffee now lukewarm, but he made no move to leave. His instincts told him that the situation wasn't finished, that something still hung in the air unspoken. The warning from Detective Alvarez replayed in his mind. He had seen enough men like those bikers to know that they wouldn't just let this go. Their kind didn't tolerate humiliation, and right now they were sitting in a cell, stewing in their own bruised egos, thinking about how to get even. The morning traffic outside had picked up, and more customers came and went, oblivious to the tension beneath the surface. But then the door opened again, and the atmosphere shifted once more. Jason's eyes flicked up immediately. Two men stepped inside. They weren't the same bikers from earlier, but they were cut from the same cloth. One was tall, thick-built with a sharp jaw and narrow eyes that scanned the room like a predator sizing up prey. The other was leaner, wiry, with a face that carried an unsettling smirk. Their leather jackets bore the same patches as the ones worn by the bikers Jason had taken down. Katrina saw them too. Jason could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly before she forced herself to relax. The cafe had more people now, regulars and newcomers, none of whom had been there for the earlier incident. That was both a blessing and a curse. It meant there were more witnesses, but it also meant there were more people who could get caught in the crossfire if things went south. The taller man approached the counter, setting his hands down on the surface as he leaned in just slightly. His smirk didn't reach his eyes. "Heard some of our boys had a little misunderstanding here earlier," he said, his voice too smooth, too calm. Katrina kept her expression neutral. "We don't do misunderstandings. You ordering something or not?" The wiry one chuckled, glancing around the cafe. His gaze briefly landed on Jason but didn't linger. "I like this one," he murmured. "Got some fire?" The taller man didn't acknowledge his friend. He kept his gaze locked on Katrina. "See, here's the thing. My friends, they don't like the way they were treated, and when they don't like something, they make sure it gets fixed." Jason set his coffee down quietly. The cafe was filled with the background noise of chatter, the hum of the espresso machine, but beneath it all there was a fragile silence, like the pause before an explosion. Katrina exhaled slowly through her nose. "If you're here to threaten me, you can leave," she said, her voice steady. The taller man smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Threaten?" "No, just giving you a chance to make things right." He tapped a finger against the counter. "Maybe next time you show a little more respect to the right people. Maybe next time things don't get messy." Jason stood. His chair scraped against the wooden floor, the sound cutting through the conversation. The movement was slow, controlled, deliberate. The wiry biker turned slightly, taking a better look at him this time. "Something to say, friend?" the wiry one asked, tilting his head. Jason held his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Just wondering if you're done wasting time," he said evenly. The taller biker's smirk twitched. He turned his full attention to Jason now, sizing him up, recognizing the calm confidence, the way Jason carried himself. Not like someone looking for a fight, but like someone who had won plenty already. "You the one that put my boys in the hospital?" he asked, voice quieter now. Jason didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the man uncomfortable. "They picked the fight," Jason finally said. "Didn't end well for them." The taller biker's fingers curled against the counter. "Yeah? And you think it's over, just like that?" Jason tilted his head slightly. "No," he said. "I think you're about to make the same mistake they did." The wiry biker let out a low chuckle, but there was an edge of nervousness to it now. The taller one exhaled through his nose, then stepped back, cracking his knuckles as he did. "See, I don't like guys like you," he said, "acting like you're better than the rest of us, like you can just walk into someone else's business and decide how things are going to go." Jason didn't move. He simply watched. "Thing is," the taller biker continued, "you don't know how deep this runs. You don't know who you're messing with." Jason remained silent for a beat. Then, with a slight shrug, he said, "Doesn't matter." The biker's jaw clenched. For a split second, Jason could see the thought cross his mind. Whether to throw the first punch, whether to risk everything in a room full of witnesses. But then, almost as quickly as the anger flared, it cooled into something darker. The taller biker leaned in one last time, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This isn't over." He turned sharply, shoving the door open as he stalked out onto the street. His wiry companion lingered for just a second longer, flashing Katrina a slow, unsettling grin. "Be seeing you," he murmured before following his friend outside. The cafe was silent for a long moment after they left. Katrina let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "Well, that was fun," she muttered. Jason picked up his coffee cup again, taking a sip. "They'll be back," he said simply. Katrina huffed a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, I figured. Jason set his cup down, his gaze distant for a moment, already calculating, already thinking ahead. Next time, he said, they won't be talking. Katrina met his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only certainty. I know. Jason nodded once, then leaned back in his seat, waiting. The cafe settled into an uneasy silence after the two bikers left. Customers exchanged nervous glances, whispering among themselves about what had just happened. Some of them had seen the earlier fight, while others had only arrived afterward, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Katrina wiped her hands on a towel, exhaling through her nose as if trying to release the pressure building inside her chest. Jason remained seated at his table, his eyes fixed on the door, his fingers lightly tapping against the ceramic of his coffee cup. He knew how this worked. The two men hadn't come to make peace. They had come to deliver a warning. And warnings, when ignored, always turned into something worse. Katrina finally broke the silence, her voice low and controlled. So, what now? Jason took another sip of coffee before answering. Now, we wait. Katrina let out a short, humorless laugh. Great, love that. She set down the towel and grabbed a fresh cup, filling it with black coffee. Her hands were steady, but Jason could see the way her shoulders tensed, the way her movements were a fraction sharper than usual. A few customers stood up, dropping money onto their tables before making quiet, hasty exits. The cafe wasn't empty yet, but it was clear that word was spreading. Trouble was brewing, and nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of it. Jason finished his coffee and stood, adjusting his coat as he did. He wasn't leaving, not yet, but he wanted to be ready. Katrina watched him carefully. You're not just going to walk out of here, are you? Jason shook his head. Not yet. Katrina exhaled, rubbing her temple. I can handle myself, you know. Jason gave her a look. It wasn't condescending, but it was knowing. I don't doubt that, he said, but it's not about what you can handle. It's about what they're willing to do. Before Katrina could respond, the door slammed open again. The tall biker from earlier stepped inside first, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. But this time he wasn't alone. 4 more men followed behind him, all of them cut from the same cloth, broad shoulders, leather jackets, eyes that held the kind of arrogance that came from knowing they had the numbers advantage. The wiry biker was among them, his grin wider than before. He leaned against the wall near the entrance, crossing his arms as if settling in for a show. The cafe went completely still. The few remaining customers froze in their seats. Even the hum of the espresso machine seemed to fade. The tall biker scanned the room before locking eyes with Jason. He smirked. Still here? Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. His stance remained relaxed, but his presence alone shifted the energy in the room. He was calm, controlled, the eye of the storm before the chaos erupted. The tall biker took another step forward. You had your fun earlier, he said, his voice low. Now it's our turn. Katrina moved behind the counter, her fingers inching toward the phone, but the wiry biker clicked his tongue, shaking his head. Wouldn't do that if I were you, he said. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt before things even start. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, but his face remained unreadable. If you're smart, he said, his voice steady, you'll walk out that door. The tall biker chuckled. See, that's where we've got a problem. You embarrassed my guys, and we can't let that slide. Jason rolled his shoulders slightly, his fingers flexing once before relaxing again. So, what's the plan? He asked. 5 against 1? Seems a little desperate. The wiry biker laughed. "You're cocky for a guy about to get his ass kicked." Jason took a slow step forward. The bikers stiffened slightly, but he wasn't rushing. He was measuring, calculating. His gaze flicked between them, already mapping out how this was going to go. The tall biker clenched his fists. "Enough talk." He moved first, lunging forward with a wild swing aimed at Jason's jaw. Jason ducked. His movements were fluid, precise, practiced. He pivoted, using the biker's own momentum against him, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The biker grunted in pain, but before he could react, Jason drove his elbow into the man's ribs, sending him stumbling backward. The next two bikers charged together. Jason sidestepped the first, catching him in the gut with a quick, brutal punch that sent him sprawling. The second reached for him, but Jason grabbed the man's jacket, using his weight to flip him over and slam him onto a nearby table. The wood groaned under the impact before the table collapsed entirely. The wiry biker cursed. "Get him!" The last two rushed in. Jason blocked the first punch, countering with a sharp jab to the throat that left the man gasping for air. The final biker hesitated for just a second too long, and that was all Jason needed. He stepped in close, grabbed the man by the front of his jacket, and drove his knee into his stomach before shoving him to the floor. Within seconds, all five bikers were either groaning, coughing, or trying to crawl away. Jason straightened, adjusting his coat like nothing had happened. Katrina stood behind the counter, eyes wide but full of something close to admiration. "Damn," she muttered. The cafe was dead silent. The customers who had remained were either too shocked to move or too awestruck to look away. The tall biker rolled onto his side, coughing. He glared up at Jason, rage burning behind his eyes. "You don't know what you just did," he spat. Jason stared down at him, his expression cold. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Before the bikers could regroup, the sound of police sirens filled the air again. The wiry biker cursed, scrambling to his feet and grabbing his friend by the arm. "We gotta go," he hissed. The bikers stumbled toward the exit, their confidence shattered, their pride broken. As they reached the door, the tall biker turned back one last time, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over." Jason didn't respond. He simply watched as they fled into the street, disappearing just as the police cruisers pulled up. Detective Alvarez stepped out first, his eyes sweeping the scene before landing on Jason. He let out a slow breath. "Why am I not surprised?" Jason shrugged. "Bad timing?" Alvarez shook his head. "Get inside. I'll handle this." Jason turned back toward the cafe. Katrina was still behind the counter, her lips pressed together in thought. When he approached, she finally looked up. "You okay?" Jason asked. Katrina huffed a breath, shaking her head. "You're insane." Jason smirked slightly. "That wasn't the question." She let out a small laugh, rubbing her face. "Yeah, I'm okay." She met his gaze. "You didn't have to do that, you know." Jason tilted his head slightly. "Yeah," he said, "I did." For the first time since the morning began, Katrina truly smiled. Jason placed a bill on the counter. "For the coffee." Katrina eyed the money, then shook her head. "After all that, it's on the house." Jason gave a small nod before turning toward the door. As he stepped outside, the first real warmth of the morning sun touched his face. The world outside kept moving, but inside that cafe, something had changed. Katrina had won her ground. Jason had made sure of it. And the next time trouble came knocking, it would think twice before stepping through that door again. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's about standing your ground when it matters most. In the end, courage is what makes the difference. What do you think about this story? Would you have done the same? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Your voice matters.